All right, so what we're looking at today is range of motion in resistance training and how that actually impacts human performance. Not just does full ROM, build muscle, but does it build strength that carries over? Does it show any signal for sport outcome transfer? I'm going to walk through three original studies and then I'll put out the patterns and give some simple coaching suggestions there. Now, ROM matters because it changes two really big things: muscle length under load and the joint angles you actually get strong in. Now, more range of motion usually means you're loading the muscle longer and through more angles, so it can be a bigger hypertrophy stimulus, and it usually creates more quote unquote usable strength. There's also a sport angle here. If deep ranges improve things like jumping, that's pretty important. So, the goal with this presentation is simple: compare three studies and translate them into what a coach should actually do. Now, the first study here is Pinto, and the basic problem is if we limit ROM, especially living in that shortened range, are we leaving gains on the table? The hypothesis was basically that full ROM or more lengthened bias training would produce bigger improvements in strength and thickness, muscle thickness, than partial ROM, especially shortened partials. Now, design-wise, it's a randomized, controlled study over 10 weeks with groups doing full ROM elbow flexion, partial ROM variations, plus a control. The outcomes are pretty clean. We measure 1 rep max elbow flexion, bicep thickness via ultrasound. Now here we have the numbers that matter. For 1 rep max elbow flexion, the full range of motion group improved about 25%. Now the partial group improved about 16%, and the control basically didn't move. For hypertrophy, both training groups grew, but full ROM was still a little bit higher, around 9.6% versus 7.8%. So the takeaway isn't that partial ROM does nothing. It's that partials still work, but full range of motion was just a better overall stimulus, especially for strength. So how do I interpret this, as a coach, as a performance practitioner? The dependent variables were obviously strength and muscle thickness. The independent variable was the range of motion condition. And the main question was whether restricting range of motion caps the adaptations. Now, based on the data, yes, full ROM was clearly the superior training methodology for strength and slightly better for hypertrophy as well. Now, the nuance is that partial ROM still improved outcomes, but if you have to pick a foundation, the full ROM is the safer bet for bigger returns here. Here we have study 2 with Bloomquist. Now this one is about squat depth. Their hypothesis was basically that partial training should improve partial strength, shallow specific strength. Deep training should give more hypertrophy and better transfer to performance, like jumping. That was the hypothesis. Now, it's a randomized 12-week training study with male students split into the deep squat group and the partial squat group, the shallow squat group. Now, the methods are progressive overload squat training, repetition matched sets, and the depth is defined pretty clearly. Deep is around 120 degrees of knee flexion, 0 to 120, and shallow is upwards of 60, so 0 to 60. Now, dependent variables include the 1 rep max, isometric strength here, which is pretty cool, squat jump performance, and imaging based muscle / tendon outcomes. Now, this is a classic, specificity result. The deep squat group improved about 20% in both deep and partial 1 rep max testing, so it carried over. Now, the partial only group improved a lot in that shallow squat 1 rep max, about 36%, but only about 9% in the deep squat, which is where you really see that angle specific, in this case, limitation. On the hypertrophy side, the deep squats increased that front thigh cross-sectional area around 4 to 7% on average. And performance-wise, the deep group improved squat jump about 15%. So shallow squats, partial squats build, shallow strength really well. But the deep squats gave a better overall combination of the two. Now, what we measured here was strength, muscle size, jump performance, and the angle-specific isometrics. And the independent variable was squat depth. And the story is, the performance improved in both groups, but it improved in different ways. So shallow training gives you a strong specificity effect, great for that range of motion specifically, not as much outside of it. Now, the deep training improved strength more broadly and showed better hypertrophy and jump transfer. So if I'm coaching for overall performance, that deep range of motion looks like the clear winner here and the higher value payoff. Now here's study 3 with Kubo, and it's another squat study. Full range of motion versus half squats, but with MRI muscle volumes, which is great detail. The hypothesis was that full depth would drive greater growth in hip-related musculature like the glutes and adductors, and plus the knee extensors there with minimal hamstring change. It's randomized. It's pre-post with 17 males split into full squat training and half squat training. Now they train for about 10 weeks, 2 times per week at that assigned depth per group, and the outcomes were measured with MRI and 1 rep max for full and half squats. Now the full squat 1 rep max improved way more in the full squat group, about 31% versus 11%, and that difference was pretty significant. For the half squat 1 rep max, both groups improved, and there wasn't a meaningful difference between them. So, regards with muscle volume, the knee extensors increased in both groups similarly, but the big difference was hip and adductor musculature. The full range of motion actually produced larger adductor and glute max increases, so those were statistically greater than the half squats. The rectus femoris and hamstrings didn't really change either, respectively. So again, full depth seems to give you more complete lower body development. Now, the dependent variables are that 1 rep max strength and muscle volumes, which are pretty, difficult measures. The independent variable is squat depth. Did performance improve? Yes, especially for usable full squat strength and hip musculature. The big coaching point for me is that half squats didn't clearly outperform full squats for half squat strength, but full squats did outperform for full squat strength and hip growth. So if I'm training, athletes, whether for sprint, jump, change of direction, that hip and adductor, hypertrophy is a strong point in favor of that deep ROM there. Now, if we zoom out across all 3 here, we do see some trends, and we see that full ROM keeps showing a similar pattern. More hypertrophy trends, especially when the muscles are loaded at longer lengths, and broader strength expression because you're training more joint angles. Now, the sport transfer signal looks stronger with deep ROM as well, like the jump improvements in that Bloomquist study. Partials aren't useless, they're just better as a tool, for specificity instead of being that entire foundation. So using those strategically to pinpoint, a specific weakness of a specific athlete, especially in preparation for some sort of competition. If, for example, maybe a power lifter, and, we notice maybe some weakness with a lockout. We do some partials there in hopes of building that strength. There are niche applications for this for sure, but that full ROM should definitely be the base. Now, here's some practical application I'd actually use from a coaching standpoint. Now, like we said, default is the full ROM for strength, hypertrophy, and for overall sport transfer. Now, that means, controlled depth, consistent tempos, good joint positions, because full ROM only counts if it's, controlled and standardized. Then partials come in as tools to overload sticking points and maybe to manage fatigue when full ROM starts to break down, or maybe just increasing specificity during any kind of peak phase. If you're going to use partials for muscle, bias them toward the lengthened range because it's probably a better stimulus based off the data. The rule is, ROM is limited by skill and control, not ego load. So, we got to make a judgment call based on, what athlete we have in front of us. But overall, definitely full ROM, especially if the athlete can handle it, and then using that partial ROM strategically. If I'm programming a power or field sport athlete, deep squat variations become the main pattern because we want strong hips and force production through a big range of motion. There's better transfer potential there. And like we said about, maybe a power lifter, I'd still build the base with full ROM in the off season, especially to build the tissue and, just get that well-rounded stimulus, reducing those weak links, and then layer in some partials strategically as needed. Now, for general population or physique clients, the full ROM is probably king. It's usually, the move for muscle and joint health, and then we can adjust ROM only when mobility demands can't be met, when there's pain or something we need to work around in that regard. Now this is a simple periodized model, so maybe for programming practicality, we start with a full ROM emphasis for a first mesocycle or first block with maybe moderate reps and progressive overload there, consistent depth. And then maybe in the middle block, we keep full ROM as the main lift, but we start to add in one or two partial, accessories or strength movements. For example, pin squats. Love pin squats. So you get the overload benefits without losing that foundation. If you do a short peak, you reduce fatigue. You keep intensity high, and only keep partials if they really match the goal, or you're seeing some really great outcomes there. The example lower body day is basically, a deep squat with the main work there and then a partial kind of overload and then another full ROM accessories. I'd keep that full range of motion with accessories for the most part. We see that, the bottom line is that full range of motion shows the most consistent improvement across strength, hypertrophy, and performance. That partial ROM tends to improve strength mostly in that specific range. Makes sense with specificity. Now, long muscle length loading looks like a major driver of adaptations based off the data. So best practice is a full range of motion foundation and then add in some partials strategically as needed. Now, if we wanted to add to the strength of evidence here, we probably want to replicate these results in trained athletes and female athletes, more diverse populations, so we can generalize the findings a little bit better. We also probably need some longer term studies on maybe tendon health and injury outcomes because, performance isn't just strength numbers. And we should probably expand to, beyond just squats and curls, obviously, presses, hinges, Olympic lifts. I think hybrid models deserve attention, full ROM base with that partial overloading, because that's how a lot of real world, programming is actually structured. But, as with any study or any, hypothesis, the more strength of evidence, the better. So we'd like to see more longer term studies and some more literature on the subject. And here we have our studies.